Welcome to episode 10 of The Front Row, brought to you by AVS Forum, sponsored by Martin Logan. I'm your host, Ryan, and today we're going to be joined by, as always, Eric Wesley and Epson's Rob Brennan to talk about everything you want to know, or thought you wanted to know, or didn't know you needed to know about HDR. But first, before we get into that, a word from our sponsor.
Bass that hits hard, fits anywhere, and sounds like it belongs. Martin Logan's Dynamo and Abyss series subwoofers deliver high performance and compact elegance with stunning precision and control. Martin Logan, bringing you truth in sound since 1983.
Welcome, everybody, on this gorgeous October day. I'm your host, Ryan, and we are joined, as always, by Eric Wesley from AVS Forum. How are you doing, Eric?
Pretty good. How are you, Ryan?
I am surviving. I'm finally recovered after CEDIA, but
Nice.
it's been good. And we are joined again by Rob Brennan. He joined us on episode... Now you're dropping me again. 5. There we go.
That's
on
hey.
episode 5. Yeah, he confused me. I'm easily confused. I'm a very gullible person. On episode 5, the history of projection. Rob, how are you doing? You said you had recovered from CEDIA, and you don't like being bored. You haven't had anything to do. So welcome back.
Exactly, right? I'm always looking for something exciting and interesting, and it's a pleasure to be here with you two fellas talking about HDR and talking about anything. I love to do it.
HDR is something that doesn't get a lot of love, but it's one of those things that makes a lot of what we love work. If we didn't have HDR, it'd be a mess. I mean, you guys have seen it all a lot too.
Spend all day outside. It would be terrible.
That's what your eyes would definitely feel like if you're watching HDR content in SDR. It'd be amazingly bright. But I'm excited to go through the histories of HDR, what makes it work, why we have it, where we're going. So, Rob, I'm going to turn this over to you. I think a great place to start for this is, why does HDR exist? Where did it come about? And really, what does it do in the displays that we use in our everyday lives?
Sure. And, they're actually just like many things in the industry, the Nexus point has a lot of tributaries that ultimately kind of worked together and ultimately formed what we now think of as HDR. The actual kind of scientific discussion around how human eyes work and how we perceive dynamic range and exposure can be traced back decades to Canada. Canada brings us lots of great things, and it's kind of the nexus of this concept goes all the way back there. But moving forward, we won't start this conversation that far back. Where does it come from and why does it exist? It depends on whether you're a pessimist or you're an optimist, I suppose, because there are two competing kind of arguments as to the origin of HDR. The pessimistic standpoint is, the same thing that kind of happened when 8K kind of televisions first hit the market. It was from display manufacturers that were looking to push back against, commodity product, and, panel prices are falling year over year. And so we need a new premium something to put on top of our product stack to boost revenue and margin. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly, I think, manufacturers were open to the idea of HDR for those reasons, but that's not the only reason HDR is in existence. Whereas 8K, when the last time the industry kind of took a rip at it, that was almost exclusively driven through that same kind of lens of, panel manufacturers, some of which also made a finished product, really interested in developing a new kind of premium product offering. What makes HDR different from that, and so why I don't subscribe to this 100% pure pessimistic, capitalist kind of idea of where it came from, is the fact that HDR took off. HDR is a thing and now is ubiquitous. There was a time when you would go to your local retailer and you had the premium HDR display and then the, middle tier non-HDR display, and essentially displays are HDR today.
Yeah. I remember the Best Buy video walls and stuff and that being a thing.
Right.
You had the aisle, the not cool aisle of all the TVs that couldn't do it. And then you had the wall of TVs all the way to the ceiling. I remember this and those were the cool TVs. And as you got further and further to the top, the less cool they became and the less feature rich they became. But it wasn't that long ago.
And it really wasn't, right? And so why was HDR successful in this regard in terms of mass adoption, and it's like 8K wasn't? So there has to be more than just manufacturer kind of push. And the answer to that really goes back to the we'll call it the artistic expansion that HDR provides. So usually when we're talking about HDR, we tend to focus on brightness. It's the easiest thing to understand. It's the easiest kind of spec to give in terms of, nit value in a HDR signal versus an SDR signal. But that's not actually the most important thing that delivers. Brightness is a vehicle. Essentially, it delivers more color potential to film creators, to TV creators, to game studios. Think of it like this. Here's the analogy. So, back in elementary school, we had the little box of Crayola crayons.
Yep.
If maybe your parents, the stock portfolio wasn't doing too hot, maybe you had this box of 16, right? But there always was that one kid who had to go there and had the box of 64 or 128 with the built-in sharpener in the back.
Oh man.
And that's the idea, is that when HDR was first essentially kind of formulated in what it would be in a format and was presented to the American Society of Cinematographers, they immediately got very excited because it's just a larger palette of color that they can use, that directors and directors of photography can use, however they choose to use it, to create more and different and varied kind of content. And so that's really where kind of the pressure for HDR to be successful came from. Now, I mentioned kind of, this pessimistic view, this, it's got to make money. And that certainly was part of the conversation. I do recall the first year that at the time when I was with Sony at CES, I was demonstrating on stage, HDR for the first time. And the president of 20th Century Fox, the film studio, came up to me along with the chief technical officer and their chief colorist, and he started peppering me with questions. And they ultimately asked me the linchpin question, which was, will consumers understand this? And will they be willing to pay for it? Because if consumers don't understand it, and if consumers don't see value in it and aren't willing to spend, any money on it, then, a studio that has to invest in software and hardware and, whatever else they've got to spend money on to make this content happen, they're not going to do it. Of course, I had to turn it around on him. So my answer to his question was, I thought this was your idea, and so we had a good chuckle and then we chatted about it. And, HDR has simply grown, over time. But again, it's important to realize that while a lot of, these technologies can be traced back to, just, companies trying to make a buck, just trying to do something a little bit differently, a little more efficiently, a little more cost effectively. HDR at least has this, I would say, kind of crown jewel of there's an artistic flexibility. There's an emphasis on, more artistic control that has helped, I think, kind of elevate HDR higher than some of the other kind of new developments in technology that are, a little more just about generating profit.
And you're saying more artistic control mainly because artists are able to utilize the color palette that they want to utilize.
Right. And so that's a good segue to talk about what I mean by more color. So
yes.
When we talk about color, we throw out a lot of technical terms. And I'm sure people that are watching this, you've heard these terms before. You've heard color space, you've heard color gamut, you've heard color bit depth, you've heard dynamic range, you've heard color volume. And while each of these terms technically refer to something a little bit different, they all come together to ultimately express how much total variation of color you can bring to bear at any one time. And so what you've probably seen before is a color space chart or a color gamut chart, which is essentially a triangle. A lot of you have seen that. And what you have is kind of the visible color spectrum that humans can see. And so typically you'll have, of course, your green, your blue, and your red, and then your secondaries, your cyan, magenta, and yellow. And inside of that roughly triangular space, you'll have these various other triangles that represent a color space or standard that is going to be used for various purposes. And we use terms like 709, right? So Rec 709 refers to a particular set of coordinates within that visible color spectrum that's been around for a long time. In fact, standard dynamic range is essentially almost always, not 100% always, but essentially uses 709 color space. And there are several other standards as well. There are standards that are used in photography, like Adobe RGB, sRGB. And then there are other kind of video standards. One of the most popular, video color spaces to use is referred to as P3, sometimes DCI P3, slightly larger color gamut than 709. So you have a little more color saturation to play with. Again, filmmakers like that because more color. And then HDR. So HDR is realistically a combination of a couple of different standards kind of all lumped together that we typically associate with one another. As it relates to color gamut or color space, HDR uses the 2020 color space, which is larger still than the previous standards. So when you think about that two-dimensional triangle, right? So the triangle's bigger. Okay, so that's more color. But color volume actually then talks about that same color triangle, but now through the luminance range or through the kind of the Z-axis. You can take any of those tones or saturations of red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, or yellow, and then you can brighten it or you can darken it. You can brighten it up to the point where it eventually becomes white, or you can darken it to the point where eventually it becomes black. And so when you think about what HDR delivers more color through essentially three vehicles. The first is it's a larger color gamut that's used. So that's that two-dimensional triangle that, again, a lot of people have seen. The second thing is it's more luminance range, or sometimes we might just say more dynamic range, rather than an SDR signal, which essentially is 0 to 100 nits, or code value 16 to 235. But let's not worry too much about that. 0 to 100 nits. We expand that, and HDR allows for 0 to 10,000 nits. So the height of that color volume is much larger. And then the third thing that it brings, and this is something that HDR does because the color's volume, this color area, is so much larger, we need a more precise way to identify a specific color inside this larger area. So that's what color bit depth is. So when we say something like 8-bit or 10-bit or 12-bit color, that's what we're referring to. It's how many bits, how many actual ones and zeros we're using to express a location inside of this potential color volume area that says, this is the specific color I want.
Rob, before you move on from that, what can happen when you use a lower color bit depth? What does that typically manifest in?
I was about to get into that because that's the reason why it exists. So yeah, it's a great question. The reason why we've gone to a 12-bit color, essentially addressing system, is think about it like this. When you had the smaller color gamut of 709 and the lower luminance range, we had a smaller volume of color information. And so if I needed to express different, let's say, tones or hues of a particular color, tones of red, I didn't need that precise of a location to show a gradation as I move from, let's say, a sunset that's got, reds to oranges to yellows. I wouldn't need to be like super crazy precise because there's not a lot of potential color addresses within this much smaller color volume potential. Once we expanded that color volume, both in the luminance range and also in kind of the saturation range, if we stuck with the 8-bit color kind of address system that we use for SDR, all of a sudden I have big gaps between each of these adjacent shades and adjacent tones and adjacent hues. And then when you have a gradation on screen, you end up with something called color banding or color contouring, where instead of a smooth transition from these various shades of reds or orange, or again in this example of a sunset, let's say from reds to oranges to yellows, instead of that being very smooth, you see these harsh transitions where there's clearly one color and then another color and then another color. So another way to think about it is this: if you live in a neighborhood with 3 or 4 single family homes, you could probably give someone very simple instructions to get from your house to the person that lives 3 houses down. You could say, go that way 3 houses, and it's like, okay, I don't need a lot of information. Now imagine living in a 50-story 1,000-unit kind of apartment complex in Manhattan, and you're trying to give someone address, walking directions to a friend of yours who lives in the next building over. It's like, okay, first you got to get to the building. What floor is it on? Okay, then I've got to turn which direction out of the elevator. All of a sudden, because there's much more area that I have to cover, I have to be much more precise with my addressing information.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what color bit depth is. It's just more finite kind of control. So we have the larger color volume. So luminance and gamut work together to create volume. And then we have more specific addressing control within that color volume. So that goes back to the analogy of, it's not 16 crayons, in your Crayola box, it's 64 crayons, it's 128 crayons. It's exponentially more color that cinematographers, movie makers, TV producers and game studios can use. So that's really what HDR aims to achieve, is a more colorful and therefore, I won't even say realistic, because some studios and directors are interested in pursuing realism, and some are not. Some are interested in pursuing something that's more surreal, but it's more flexibility of color and contrast and control.
Okay, so you talking a little bit more about how it works, and something else that's really important. You mentioned 10,000 nits, right? When we're talking about the range at which HDR can operate in, we're moving from 100 nit limitation to 10,000 nits. And that's not to say that all content is mastered at 10,000 nits, because very few actually is, but you have the capability to do that. Now, I think something else would be cool to go into would be very few displays, if any, right now, can actually do 10,000 nits. So something else that ends up happening because of HDR is tone mapping, right? So they kind of go hand in hand. HDR allows for this tremendous amount of artistic potential, but that doesn't mean that every display is able to do everything that the artist is doing within that, using that palette. So how do we transition this thing that artists are using and allow everybody at home or anybody that's seeing this reproduced away from a mastering monitor to be able to see it as accurately as possible?
And that's an excellent question, and that really is what we should obviously talk about next. So when we think about, first of all, let's define what tone mapping is. Tone mapping is a method of taking the requirements, or let's say the specification of your source content. So you're streaming a movie, you're playing a video game, you're watching TV, whatever it is. And within that content, there's this color information. There's this HDR potential, right? And again, think of like this space of color, and within this space, here's everything we're going to use. But your display can't achieve that same performance, whether it's I can't achieve that same color gamut response, or I can't achieve that level of luminosity, or maybe I can't even achieve that same black level requirement. So what do? Do I just refuse to play the content? That seems like a non-starter. So tone mapping is a way of essentially, and this is not the technically correct term, but I'll use it and I'll explain more about it. But it's a way of compressing the incoming signal down into a way where the display can essentially retain the kind of, we'll call it the artistic integrity. The goal would be to maintain the artistic integrity of the content, but recognize that something is going to have to be left behind.
Or compromising in order to make it viewable in some capacity. Exactly,
right. And so the thing about tone mapping that ultimately is interesting is there is no objectively wrong tone mapping. There is no user guide. There's no standardized body that exists that says if your incoming signal, let's just talk luminance for a second. If your incoming signal happens to be 10,000 nits, but your display is only 1,000 nits, here's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist. So every display manufacturer has, their own artistic ability to decide what they want to prioritize. So
They
some
have their
manufacturers
own artistic intent or intention on the original artistic intent or intention.
right, and so we're iterating quite a bit now. We're getting down this rabbit hole, and so sometimes a manufacturer may choose to prioritize one thing over another because maybe that's what they're known for in the industry. Right? So maybe they want to prioritize, black level, or maybe they want to prioritize peak highlights or a high average picture level. Whatever it is they want to prioritize, or any combination.
And you say prioritize because it's it's impossible to have all of them, right? Because if you had all of them, you would have the original signal. Like
you would have exactly. You would have the original.
Pick and choose, and you've got to decide which pathway, which fork in the road you go down to make this compromise, because you're giving up something.
Yes, you absolutely are. But also, before we get too far down that, I want to point something out. You're absolutely right. Very, very few pieces of content are mastered today at 10,000 nits. By far, the most common kind of max luminance that's used is 1,000 nits. And that's because of cost, right? The primary mastering display that's used in Hollywood, if not around the world, is manufactured by Sony. It's the BVM X300, which was the original mastering, or kind of the one that kicked all this off, or the BVM HX310. Both of those mastering monitors had a peak luminance of 1,000 nits. And so if you graded your movie to 1,000 nits, we could do it in one pass, right? Because you could see everything on that monitor at one time. So we would just look at the entire image. We would make some adjustments, but nothing is clipped, nothing is hidden. I go through my content, I do my one pass, and I'm done. If I wanted to grade a piece of content at 4,000 or 10,000 or how brighter than 1,000 nits, I would have to reduce the contrast on my mastering monitor so that I could see what's above 1,000 nits. And that then might take a few additional passes just to confirm the highlight details, everything above 1,000 nits. And of course, that just increased the cost for film production because it's more time during this kind of mastering and grading process. So the majority of movies, 1,000 nits, because that's what the hardware allowed to be done cost effectively. Now, in the future, we actually expect content to be more often graded at a higher peak luminance value. And that's simply because Sony a few years ago introduced a new 4,000 nit mastering monitor. So now that the tools are a little bit better, we'll call it higher performance for studios, they then can master it at higher luminance ranges without kind of incurring the additional cost. But let's get back to what we're talking about with tone mapping. So again, tone mapping is this idea of square peg, round hole, right? And the good news is that displays, specifically flat panel displays, have done an excellent job of increasing their capabilities in both, color gamut capability and also luminance range, so that the amount of tone mapping or compression, if you want to use that word, that has to happen can be minimal, right? It's not as extreme as potentially it was, when HDR first kind of was out and about. Now you have less of that tone mapping that has to happen, but tone mapping still happens. One of the key differences I think that's important, and I just want to mention this now, but I think we'll come back to this, but I just want to say this now, is that while televisions have done a very good job of kind of expanding their capabilities in regards to HDR to keep up and minimize the demands of tone mapping, projectors have struggled. Projectors typically, for a long time, have struggled with having the same kind of increases in brightness over time that TVs have been able to achieve. You can go get a TV today that will produce 3,000-4,000 nits of peak brightness. And although we don't really talk nits when it comes to projectors, when you're looking at a projector that's maybe 2,000 lumens, and you try to light up a typical screen, let's say maybe 120 inches, and then you convert that measurement over to nits, you're going to find you're in the 100 or so kind of nit range, maybe 100, 150.
Now, an important distinction there, though,
difference
is that a lot of TVs that are showing multi-thousand nit measurements, that is not a 100% full white.
That is correct. Now, one of the interesting things about HDR is, and I mentioned this earlier, average kind of picture level, or APL. So moving forward, if I say APL, I'm referring to the average picture level. What's interesting about HDR versus SDR is the original concept, the original kind of thought was that the average picture level would be the same between SDR and HDR. HDR would allow for highlights. It would allow for this range of color where an SDR signal would simply clip and say, I can't show you the color blue in the bright sky, or I can't show you the deep shadow detail, underneath that bus. I can't see Pennywise at all inside the sewer because it's too dark and shadowy. But that was the idea, right? Studios and cinematographers and people who do lighting for Hollywood production still largely light scenes the same way. The cameras would just capture more, and there would be more information in the final product. Now, the reality is that's not actually happened. The average picture level in HDR has risen from essentially 100 nits being kind of diffused white in SDR to being just a little bit higher than 200 nits for HDR. But again, when you think about going from 100 nits, 0 to 100 in an SDR signal compared to potentially 0 to 10,000 in an HDR signal, imagine that huge potential increase. But the diffused white, that peak white value has only gone up by 100 nits. It still means that generally speaking, yes, you're right, that it doesn't mean when I say 1,000 nits, the entire image is in 1,000 nits. That's peak luminance. The reason why it's important to projector manufacturers, and this has been kind of a pain point, and why we're so excited for the future at Epson with our high brightness models, is it's not about whether you have this high peak luminance that you can hit to make that one pixel look really good, in that one shot. The problem is, again, going back to tone mapping. So while every manufacturer has their own flexibility in how tone mapping is going to work, there are a couple generally accepted rules. And I'll give you kind of the general rules. So we are going to decide, are we going to clip our highlights, or are we going to try to preserve highlights in a given scene, right? If the scene is just, me sitting here, I'm talking, and there's one really bright spotlight back there. Can we get rid of it? Can we get rid of the yellow in that spotlight and just make it white? Is that acceptable? Or to maintain the color, do we have to darken everything to keep it? Part of the way that, you might make this decision is the relationship in brightness value between the average picture level, kind of the main point of your shot, and the peak brightness. So if you have a relatively high average picture level, like you're shooting a scene outside, right? Naturally lit, cars driving by in the streets means your average picture level is really high. And then you have a really bright peak highlight. The problem is, if I dim the entire image to maintain the highlight, I've dimmed everything, including the main point of the shot. And so my tone mapping strategy for that scene might be just clip the highlight, because the APL is too high and the peak luminance is too close to it. So cut off the peak. And we call that white clipping. We're just going to transition to white, no big deal. That's fine. That's easy enough to do. The real problem is when there is very little distance between the peak luminance in a scene and the average luminance in a scene, because then you have this very harsh transition into white. So in that scenario, what we typically do is we dim the entire image, because we have to preserve the peak highlight. It's too close to the average. And so when that happens, and you have a projector that has a limited brightness output, you end up with a very dark HDR image. And so projectors and HDR has always been kind of an interesting relationship. As a matter of fact, for 10 years, I have personally, I work for Epson today, but I worked for other manufacturers in the past, and I still do this to this day. I personally, Rob Brennan, recommends that in many cases, you disable HDR in your projector at home, because the chances are very good that your projector's lumen output combined with your screen size doesn't produce enough on-screen brightness to make effective HDR. And that's just my personal take on most projected systems. But that's just a little bit of how kind of tone mapping works. It hasn't always been this way. In the first 1 or 2 years after HDR hit the market, TVs had a significant problem. And the problem was SDR was brighter than HDR content. And again, we just talked about, HDR luminance range and color, and HDR is a better image, right? Well, year one, if you really had an eye for brightness, SDR content on your flat panel televisions was brighter than HDR. And that has to do with the fact that for a television, everything's always asked to run at 100%. So SDR is a relatively small color volume, and we would pin it to the brightest capability of the TV. HDR is a much larger kind of color volume potential, and we would pin it to the maximum performance of your TV. And it meant that HDR could go down quite a bit. So in order to make HDR more expressive, it just got darker and darker and darker and darker. And this was a problem for not only TV manufacturers, but companies like Dolby, who have an amazing technology in Dolby Vision that they're trying to license not only to studios, but to display manufacturers. And you have a certain subset of consumers that are saying, I think SDR is better than HDR. It's not delivering what I thought it was going to deliver.
Everybody said HDR was too dark at first.
Yeah, HDR was too dark. What's going on? It's supposed to be brighter, but it's too dark. So what ended up happening after just a couple of years is that, out of the box, and you can adjust some of this, but out of the box, when your display, typically television, sees an SDR signal, it's not running at 100% like backlight power, right? So it'll tone itself down a little bit. And then when you switch over to HDR, not only does it increase to 100% like brightness, but it locks itself and you can't turn it down, right? So your HDR is almost always guaranteed to give you this kind of visceral impact when you watch it. That's like, that's clearly HDR versus SDR. And again, that's another fundamental difference between television and projection, is that projectors are always running at 100% brightness because they're somewhat brightness limited relative to TV. So for projectors, it's like we're living in year one of HDR. SDR is brighter than HDR on a projector. And so you need a lot of brightness in your projector, I think, to make really impactful HDR experience.
Before we carry on and continue to learn a little bit more about tone mapping in HDR, let's hear a word from our sponsor, Martin Logan.
This episode is brought to you by the Martin Logan Dynamo and Abyss series subwoofers. Packed with high output, high precision aluminum cone woofers, powerful amplification, and ultra precise DSP, these subwoofers deliver deep controlled bass. They're built to perform and designed to fit seamlessly into any space. Martin Logan, bringing you truth in sound since 1983.
Welcome back to The Front Row, brought to you by AVS Forum, sponsored by Martin Logan. I'm your host, Ryan, joined as always by Eric Wesley from AVS Forum. And today's guest is Rob Brennan from Epson. And today we are talking about, just to reiterate, tone mapping in HDR. And I think the next direction that we should go, we've learned a little bit about tone mapping, we've learned a little bit about HDR. Let's talk about the differences that different versions of HDR can present, because you've got HDR 10, you've got HDR 10 plus, you've got Dolby Vision. We can even throw HLG in there. There's now Dolby Vision 2. There's a plethora of different versions, and I think it gets a bit confusing for the average consumer on what am I gaining? Does any of this matter? And what does it all mean? So Rob, I'll transition or turn this back over to you.
Sounds great. So yeah, as you said, we were just talking about tone mapping, and tone mapping, this idea of square peg, round hole, converting a high dynamic range signal down into the capabilities of your display. How we do that relates to how much information we have about the incoming source, which is really the main distinguishing factor between these types of HDR that you mentioned, HDR 10, HDR 10 plus, and Dolby Vision. There are slight nuances, but the biggest kind of elephant in the room difference has to do with something called metadata. This is simply in the video kind of stream, in the data that's coming from your Blu-ray or your Apple TV or wherever you're getting your source, in addition to the actual video information, is this metadata that tells you information about what it is that you're watching. And this metadata, for all intents and purposes for this discussion in HDR, comes in two flavors. You have static metadata and you have dynamic metadata. Static metadata is information that refers to the content as a whole. So I'm watching a 3-hour long movie, and I'm going to have some information about the movie in general. I'm going to know what the brightest pixel of any frame of video is for the entire piece of content. And I'll know what the average is for the content as well. With those pieces of information, I then make my tone mapping decisions. With dynamic metadata, I can have information all the way down to each frame of video. So, your typical Hollywood movie is presented at 24 frames per second, 2 hours long. So that's a lot of frames. And within each of those frames, I can have metadata that, again, says, well, what's the average and what's the peak for this frame of video. And so when you think about it in these very kind of simple terms, static versus dynamic metadata. With dynamic metadata, your tone mapping decision making can be better because you have more information. And I have information for every frame of video because I might have, in a given piece of content, very dark scenes with not a lot of color information where, maybe what my display is capable of reproducing exceeds what it's being asked to reproduce within that given scene of video. So maybe tone mapping, I don't need any. Mm-hmm. And then with that very same piece of content, 5 minutes later, there could be an explosion of brightness and color and all of this amazing information coming in from my source that far exceeds the capability of my display.
Now,
so how my display reacts is going to be different.
When you're saying this, I'm assuming it's also you're still beholden by how that individual manufacturer is doing the tone mapping. So while it's getting more data, how they're dealing with that data is going to vary from manufacturer to manufacturer still.
Yeah, absolutely. There's still, that the beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? Each manufacturer still decides, I have this information, but I still prioritize what I want to prioritize for various kinds of reasons. But again, just very generally speaking, the more data you have, the more, let's just say, accurate you can be with regards to what you're trying to do is. Not necessarily, when I say accurate to what the creative intent was, because you as a manufacturer could choose to ignore creative intent if you want. There's no creative intent police that are going to say, oh, that's not what yellow is supposed to look like. So that's a great point. So generally speaking, tone mapping utilizes metadata, and there are two kinds of metadata. And then, as you mentioned, there are essentially 4 flavors of HDR. So HDR10. HDR10 is the most common. It is most often used by Hollywood because it's open source. There's not licensing that really goes into play with HDR10 content. It uses static metadata. So it has the least amount of, let's say, information when it comes to the video source, but still it's the most popular that's used because it is cost effective, quite frankly. Now, I do feel obligated to kind of mention that display manufacturers, both projectors and TV manufacturers, have gotten very good from a processing perspective so that they essentially can attempt to recreate dynamic metadata in real time. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that stops, basically your computer processor inside your television or your projector from looking at the incoming frame of video and finding out what's the brightest pixel, what's the average pixel, which would be similar information to what's available in kind of dynamic metadata. So right. The gap that used to exist between static and dynamic has shrunk, but there are still, some differences. Sure. I just want to throw that out there, right? So that's HDR 10. Open source, static metadata. I think the next one to talk about from a pure contrast perspective, in that it's the most different, would be Dolby Vision from Dolby Laboratories. So Dolby Vision is, first of all, it's licensed, right? Not only licensed to the studio, that has to license kind of the workflow process, but also has to be licensed by the display manufacturer. So the display manufacturers essentially need permission to access the Dolby Vision stream. So the actual data that's coming through your HDMI cable or the internet or wherever you're getting it from. So there's a cost associated with it, in either case. And Dolby Vision uses dynamic metadata. So you get a wealth of information about each frame, potentially up to each frame of video, so that you can make, again, the best tone mapping decisions possible based on what you think you should be doing. That's what the display manufacturer thinks what should be doing.
Now, something that I just thought about, and I don't know how many people actually think about this, is I just brought up the point of every manufacturer's tone mapping being different, even though they have dynamic metadata incoming. What they do with that data can vary. I'm assuming it's the same with Dolby Vision. You are not every display is going to handle Dolby Vision the same way, even though our thought process when we see Dolby Vision says, what I see here is going to be the same as I see here. All you're getting effectively is a license to see the data, and then what you do with that data is entirely up to the manufacturer and can change from one manufacturer to the other. Am I correct?
That's absolutely the case. And I can tell you it was a big shock when back in the early days, I was working with a number of reviewers that were very excited for the potential of taking, at the time, 2 different TVs from 2 different manufacturers, but they knew that the TVs were using the same panel, so the same potential capability, and they wanted to take a Dolby Vision source and put it to both televisions, and they believed what would happen is the image would be identical. And I'm trying to explain, I'm like, that's not going to happen. That's not what you're going to get. Because yes, there is no correct tone mapping. There is no, you must do tone mapping this way. And there's 2 reasons for that, quite frankly. There's a little mini segue here. It's not up to Dolby. If you think who would it be up to? And maybe you think, well, it's obviously up to Dolby. But it's not up to Dolby to say, hey, director Quentin Tarantino made this movie, and it's graded a certain way, and a certain color information and contrast and luminance and whatever. And for this frame of video that calls for 4,000 nits, if you have a 400 nit TV, you've got to do this. Otherwise, it's not a Tarantino film. And if you have an 800 nit TV, well, then you do it this way. It's like that's not their part to play in any of this. Yeah. Neither is it, it's also why I say that there's not a correct, objectively true way to do it, because it's not up to Epson or Sony or JVC or LG or Samsung or anyone who makes the display technology to be also the de facto, this is the way that you do it in terms of tone mapping. And then, of course, then there's also the display manufacturers no display manufacturer is interested in having their display look like everyone else's display.
Yeah.
It's like if every display looked the same, you would just walk into Best Buy and say, what's the cheapest 50-inch TV you sell? Because they all look the same, right?
Yeah. It allows a display to have its own flavor,
right,
if you will, right? Sony's known for one way, Epson, Samsung, they're all known for their own things. And them doing their processing differently allows another level of that to take place.
That's right. I love the word used there, that flavor, right? That kind of exists within that space. So again, that's the primary difference between HDR10 and Dolby Vision, is the existence of metadata and licensing.
Okay.
Then you have HDR10 Plus. HDR10 Plus is kind of a hybrid of the 2. It is essentially utilizing the open source nature of HDR10, but during the workflow process, so during the actual process of making the film, dynamic metadata is generated. So essentially, think of it like this. We take an HDR10 movie. It doesn't have dynamic metadata. The metadata is only content, based, not frame by frame by frame. Mm-hmm. And we take that file, we put it in a computer, and we say, hey, computer, please measure and give me a text file that shows the peak and average luminance for every frame of video. And suddenly, I've generated dynamic metadata, and that gets added into the data stream and sent out as HDR10 Plus. Now, HDR10 Plus exists for several reasons. Like HDR in general, it has lots of kind of tributaries that led down to ultimately why it exists today. In a lot of ways, it exists because there's a benefit to dynamic metadata, and certain display manufacturers were like, but I don't want to pay for Dolby Vision. It's like, what do I do? And that's essentially where HDR10 Plus kind of comes from, is these 2 competing pressures, right? Can I get better HDR results with more data? Yes. Do I have to pay a licensing fee to a certain company to get access to it? Is that the only way? Well, if you want their version, or you can make your own. What I will say is HDR10 Plus, while it certainly exists today, and Epson projectors, some of them support HDR10 and HDR10 Plus, the battle lines are essentially HDR10 and Dolby Vision. HDR10 Plus never really took off. It's not super widely used. More than anything, I would say Dolby Vision continues to kind of prove its worth, I would say, in the space, and it certainly has the brand recognition, which has encouraged more display manufacturers, more studios, and even more streaming platforms to adopt Dolby Vision as one of their kind of premium format standards. There's still some HDR10 Plus in there, just in terms of the volume. It's largely still HDR10, #1 market share. Dolby Vision would be second place. And then you mentioned the last one, and we'll talk about it very briefly, but it's simply not really ever been executed in any large format, which is HLG, or hybrid log gamma. So first of all, what does hybrid log gamma mean? The gamma of hybrid log gamma refers to SDR. When we talk about gamma correction in a display, EOTF, electro-optical transfer function, we're referring to gamma style contrast. Log is what we would typically use to refer to as HDR contrast, which is absolute, right? So absolute value for black, and then code values up from there. Whereas SDR is a relative, kind of contrast system. We just have some more flexibility. So it's a hybrid between log HDR and gamma SDR. So that's what HLG stands for. HLG exists pretty much exclusively in the broadcast space, because broadcasters have a problem. Some of their customers that want to consume their broadcast have an HDR TV, and some have an SDR TV. And so if they want to broadcast a show, typically most often something that's live, so live sports, if they want to broadcast an HDR version for some of their customers and an SDR version for other customers, they need 2 channels to do that. And just like a company that's making physical Blu-ray media has to deal with a physical limitation on how much data can fit on a disc, broadcasters have the same problem. There's only so much bandwidth that they have. There's only so many channels that they can deploy. There's only so much data per channel that they can deploy. And they're already doing hundreds of channels, right? And so they had this problem. I can't really afford, quite frankly, to have an HDR channel and then the exact same content on a separate channel that's an SDR. So hybrid log gamma was developed as a way that essentially the SDR signal could have a modifier placed on top of it with this kind of, we'll call it HDR tail for the higher luminance information. And if your display could read HDR, it would read the entire, data stream for essentially the HDR version of your HLG broadcast. And if you had an SDR TV that couldn't understand this extra kind of flare, it would ignore it. And so you would get an SDR broadcast instead. But outside of a few special broadcasts that have been done primarily in the UK and in Japan by the Tokyo Broadcast Company or by the British Broadcast Company, largely HLG has not really taken off. Time will tell if it ever, really is adopted in a big way. But outside of very special kind of one-off events, largely HLG broadcast is not, quite frankly, did not become as popular as it otherwise would.
Right.
Again, because it's primarily used for those live broadcasts. For something that's pre-recorded, you just access what stream version you want. Are you going to stream the HDR version or you stream the SDR version? And so it doesn't really matter because disk storage in someone's cloud server is nothing compared to the actual broadcast.
You mentioned hybrid log gamma,
Mhm.
and I think that's important. You also mentioned a traditional gamma and EOT functions. Can we talk about how that information is different in HDR? Because it's communicated to the display in a different way, right? It's absolute. with PEQ. And I think that it's important for people to understand why that differentiation exists and what can happen. Maybe we use that to segue into what can happen when things go wrong, right? What do you run into? Like if your TV's in SDR and you send it an HDR signal, what does that manifest as?
Oh yeah.
Throw some troubleshooting in here at the end.
You know, I will talk about that second, but I will say the good news is in the early days of HDR, you would regularly encounter those errors.
Yes.
It's gotten much better, but it still occasionally pops up its head. So yeah, let's talk about these two essentially systems of contrast. That's really what the difference between HDR and SDR, or log and gamma, or as you said, PQ and gamma are. So, and you mentioned using the word absolute or relative, and those are words that I use to describe these as well. Let's start with HDR. When we say absolute, what is it that I mean by that? First of all, what it means is that black, right? Let's start with black. When I get a code value that comes in from my source material that calls for 0 nits, right? 0 incandescents per square meter. That's what I'm going for. That has to be tied to the darkest color my display can reproduce. And I have no ability, there's no setting that I can go into in my display to change that. So it is fixed to 0. And that's what we mean by absolute. It must be pinned at 0. I do have some adjustments that I can make, both in calibration for where my peak is going to be. And then a lot of display manufacturers will give you some ability to affect a little bit how their tone mapping strategy kind of works, to generally brighten up maybe an image a little bit or to darken an image a little bit, which is really referring to what happens after 0. So 0 has to be black, the darkest thing your display can do. But after that, you know, display manufacturer might give you a little bit of adjustability for your preference or for your environment. But absolute means tied to black. With gamma, or EOTF, what's more important than the absolute value of black is the relationship between how dark your image is and how bright your image is, right? So this content that we watch that's SDR, it typically was graded at 100 nits. But it was graded in a perfectly dark environment that's light controlled. But your home is not that environment. And so you have this gamma function in your TV that allows you to take the entire contrast range from black to white, from the darkest to the brightest, and move it up or move it down, depending on the environmental conditions that you're in. So if I'm in a very bright room, I might choose, you know, TVs are all a little bit different in how they talk about gamma, but the most traditional way would be 2.4 gamma would be the ideal target for dark room, all the lights off, you know, black room viewing. But I might instead go 2.2, which is brighter, or 1.8, which is even brighter, because I have a lot of ambient light that I have to deal with. So that gamma functionality I refer to as a relative contrast system. The range of contrast between dark and bright, between black and white on screen is fixed, but I can slide their absolute values up or down depending on what I prefer to look at or what my environmental conditions are that might require a brighter or a darker image. But with HDR, and this is another, I think, good point to make. I'll give you kind of this example. A few years ago, they remastered Alien in HDR. Now, Alien is a movie that is primarily communicated through the following colors: black, near black, kind of black, sort of black, mostly black, and gray.
Yeah.
Right? And so with HDR, because black has to be tied to 0, it's got to be absolute. If you try to watch that movie in your living room, no matter how bright your TV is, with all the lights turned on, there's stuff you're not going to be able to see. And there's no amount of just brighten the image you can do to get that shadow detail back, because black is fixed at 0, absolute contrast. If you were to take that same movie and watch the SDR version in your living room at 3 in the afternoon with all the windows open, we could adjust the brightness, we could adjust the gamma, and we could crank everything up until I could see everything I'm supposed to see. Now, would it be real black, right? If we measured it, would black be 0? No, it wouldn't, right? But I'd be able to see everything. So that's this difference between gamma or EOTF versus PQ or ST2084, which is different words we use to describe this contrast system and the differences between how they're deployed. So the one thing I typically do recommend, especially to projector owners, it's that while you absolutely can get a projector that's bright enough to go in your living room, manage expectations. If you have a living room projector and you want to fire it up at 2 p.m. and you're watching People's Court, and then 10 minutes later you're like, now I'm going to watch Alien in HDR, you're going to have a bad time. Maybe watch the SDR version during the day, the HDR version at night. It would be my general recommendation for those types of customers. So now that we've talked about HDR, and I just mentioned, projectors and HDR and TVs and HDR, what I think is valuable information to kind of have is to understand that there are kind of different expectations that we should have when it comes to HDR performance with different display technologies, television versus projector. A few minutes ago, I mentioned, for example, that TVs have done a bang-up job of keeping up with, increased brightness, increased, color gamut reproduction as time has gone on to essentially, we'll say, minimize the amount of tone mapping that's required in order to maintain as much of the creative intent as seen through the eyes of the display manufacturer as possible. And again, projector manufacturers, it's not as easy, right? The industry has largely gone from lamps to lasers, which has helped, right? But it's still quite difficult to put, many tens and tens and tens of thousands of lumens through a projector that is compact and quiet and isn't as loud as your vacuum cleaner, that's running on like standard power. That's the engineering kind of challenge.
Well, your other problem there too is the amount of light coming from an emitted, in most cases, let's say 65-inch average size TV, to a 150-inch projection screen, it goes up exponentially. So while you may you may have a highlight that can do 10,000 nits, it being that small, the amount of light that it's actually pushing back into the room, where if you did that with pixels that are significantly larger over a larger area, it goes up and can get out of control quite rapidly to the point where people's eyes hurt. And I like my retinas melting, but that is something that a lot of people don't think about, that what we see in like a theater, like a commercial cinema, we think it's really bright, but the screen is enormous. And if you actually measure, you may be at X number of foot Lamberts, way down low. I can't remember the actual.
I'm actually thrilled that you brought this up, because this actually is probably the most complicated thing to understand when it comes to HDR as it relates to screen size and brightness, and how much do you really need? So you open this can of worms. Let's eat it. So first, just real quick, when you think about, we use the word nits, and for projectors, classically we would use the word foot Lamberts. Largely, they're the same thing. One is imperial, one is metric. What are we talking about? Well, nits is a measurement of brightness per square meter, incandescence per square meter. That's what a nit is. So here's an interesting fun fact. A 65-inch television is almost exactly 1 square meter.
Yep.
Which means if I take a measurement of that, peak brightness that I can achieve on my 65-inch TV and my reading is 1,000 nits, that also means that the total illumination potential of my 1 square meter, display is also 1,000 incandescents. But if I then switch to a projector that's conveniently enough 130-inch diagonal, that's 4 square meters. If I tried to generate the same 1,000 nits, that's my measurement, I would actually have 4 times more total illumination coming off the screen.
Yep.
And that is a lot.
It is.
And then you go from there, right? I mean, think about how big a movie theater screen is, right? Those are measured in feet, many feet. So a 65-inch TV, and then we go to, let's say, a 60 a 650 inch, which is only like 54 foot diagonal.
Only.
That's 100 times the area. So now that same 1,000 nit is like the sun, and it's uncomfortable. So now that we've kind of talked through that, it will help you understand why your television might be trying to hit 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 nits, and it's 85 inches. But when you go to the AMC theater and you go into the Dolby Cinema, that's rated at 105 nits. That's the target because the screen is much larger than your TV. And then when you go to IMAX, which is especially the real big IMAX, the stadium seating, that IMAX screen, 75 nits, right? Because the screen is so much larger. So the amount of light that we're seeing is not this spot measurement, as you point out, Ryan. It's not the spot measurement. It's the volume of total light.
Yeah.
So what we can infer from this, or what we should then start thinking about critically, if from a projector standpoint, a projected image at home is larger than your TV, but smaller than a Dolby Cinema. So how much brightness should I be going for? 106, probably not that much, because my home theater or my living room projector, wherever my projector is, isn't as big as an AMC digital cinema, but it's also bigger than 85 inch. So am I closer to 1,000 nits to the TV, or am I closer to 100 nits on the theater screen? Where do I need to be?
And this opens a whole nother can of worms, because depending on where you want to go in that luminance, you're compromising potential on theoretical artistic intent from high dynamic range, right? I can't get to certain colors without having the luminance in the color gamut. So what am I going to compromise on? Am I going to go blind in 10 years because I'm watching it X number of nits and there's huge amounts of reflected light coming back at me because I want that color? Or am I going to sacrifice that for comfortability, but lose all of that, what we'll call color accuracy, because the tone mapping's having to work more?
That's right.
What you bring up with worms is, where do you compromise? What is the acceptable procedure? Which way do you go? And we mentioned this with kind of display manufacturers doing their own thing with tone mapping. Now you're bringing the choice into your own room. Where do you go? Which is the right way to go? I don't know that anybody has a good answer for that, but that is something that I think people should talk about more, in that direct emitted light from a TV is very different from reflected light, mainly because of scale. And if you don't think about the scale and you try and equate them together, you're going to have a bad time.
Absolutely right. And you're also correct in that for the longest time, there was zero guidance provided by anybody. And so a lot of ideas kind of came to the surface, right?
Yeah.
I remember back in the early days, we just used to say, how bright should your projected image be? As bright as you can stand it, right? It's like, that's how bright it should be. Because you want your HDR to be impactful, that's its function. But in terms of a foot-Lambert target or a nit target, it's like, I don't know. SMPTE doesn't know, THX doesn't know, Dolby doesn't have any guidance for us, so we're just left to our own devices. What's happened over time, I think, unfortunately, is that because projectors have typically a certain amount of brightness that they output, and it hasn't really changed dramatically over the last 10 years, we've grown to accept. And you'll hear people say pretty often, oh, you need like 150, 200 nits is good for HDR in a projected image. And the reality is that's the target we use for SDR in a projected image. If you sit, I mean, I was just with ISF like last week. You sit down there and you go through your ISF kind of certification. They're gonna give you a rough target, not an exact number, but yeah, shoot for 180, shoot for 150 to 180, somewhere in there for your SDR. If that's good for SDR, excuse me, it's certainly not good enough for HDR. But we still haven't answered the question.
Actually, say 100 nits for SDR.
Yeah, and some people, and that would be again fine for reference, right?
Yeah.
So then the question really is, what do we do? Who's right? Who's wrong? The good news is that I mentioned this kind of before. The DCI, the Digital Cinema Initiative, is this organization that kind of creates standards. It's a group of Hollywood studios, right? as well as in this case, shout out to Christie Projectors, right? They're part of the DCI as well. They all work together to agree on standards, because while a studio may compete with another studio in terms of box office numbers on a given, weekend, or, trying to buy the rights to a particular script or hire a particular director, they also often work together. They rent out, sound stages, or, crews, or one is, kind of shooting it, but one's going to publish it, one's going to distribute it, and all this kind of stuff's going to happen. So it's important for all these studios to kind of have a common language. Mm-hmm. And this includes everything from, what color space we're going to use, what's the encryption protocol we're going to use, so that, a movie that we're shooting can be played back in a movie theater using a Christie projector, or using, a Dolby Vision, kind of server, because it's going to be the Dolby Vision version of that film. So that's what the DCI is, the Digital Cinema Initiative. In February of 2024, they released the new standard. Among other things, it has now defined the target luminance range for large format projection and what they call direct view, which is video wall. That calls for 299.6 nits, plus or minus 10%. Now, I hate decimals, so we'll say 300 plus or minus 30. So 270 to 330, I think, is a good, at least general guidance, so that we think about how much brightness do I need on screen? What's a good screen size I can pair with my projector? What's the right gain for my screen material that I should utilize to try to be somewhere in this kind of area? What I think is really interesting is, if you remember the company Oppo, right? Everyone loved Oppo Blu-ray players back in the day. They had their own tone mapping algorithm built in that you could turn on. 300 nits was the target that they had set up in the menu specifically for projectors. So this idea for 300, it's not like it's brand new. The industry in general has been talking about this for a while. It's also why you're starting to hear grumblings about Dolby Cinema going to 300 nits. It's not necessarily a decision that Dolby makes. They're affected by the DCI. They're essentially kind of part and adjacent to it, because they are in the professional film exhibition business and the professional film kind of making business and the kind of consumer home reproduction film business. So when a new standard comes out that says, hey, we want to make movies a certain way, they certainly are going to be interested in that and want to understand it. And, there you go.
Now, does the body that defines the 300 nits, have they defined how big the screen is for that brightness?
That is a great question. So they have not defined, like, here's what the part that's missing still, in my opinion. Someone much smarter than me needs a formula that says, take your screen size, and therefore we can determine a target brightness range based on that value. Now,
but even then,
wrong,
the problem with that is, I think you were going there too.
Yeah, then you have hundreds of potential tone mapping kind of algorithms that have to be deployed. But shout out to MadVR. That's where you can say, make a company like a MadVR or Luminant or someone that's doing an outboard processor, make them responsible for that.
This isn't my problem anymore.
Manufacturers are like, so I don't know that we'll ever get, or that we'll ever really have that kind of standard. This got kind of a sliding scale. I at one point tried to come up with a formula that somehow could quantify, a 28-inch mastering monitor that's 4,000 nits, the new, BVMHX 3110 from Sony, and the IMX, 75 nit massive screen, and create a curve that expressed everything along it. After about 2 days, I was like, no, I'm done.
We talked about this before. It's too much of a compromise. And where on that line do you compromise? So you get using the color and blinding yourself, or are you allowing tone mapping to do it and bringing in compression? I mean, which way do you go?
And I think there are two final things I'd like to say when it comes to brightness. There certainly is a point where you can have too much brightness, where the brightness, and again, I'm not just talking about the nit value, because as you brought up, very importantly, it's the nit value and then the screen size. So the actual like physical illumination that your body's going to physically react to. You can get to a point where it's too much. I have sat through demonstrations from display manufacturers before where they really wanted to show off, and oh boy, did they show off. But it was painful, like physically uncomfortable to look at. So that can absolutely happen. But it's also important to understand that without sufficient brightness, tempered by screen size, something like HDR suffers, quite a bit because of the amount of tone mapping that has to happen. There has to be so much compromise to the signal that you end up with a viewing experience that is potentially not worth attempting to do HDR. Right. And that goes back to, again, for many years, I would congratulate someone on their brand new projector purchase. Welcome to the Projector family. I don't even care what name is on the box. I'm just glad you're here. I love people who love projectors. By the way, I recommend turning off HDR because, I know how bright that projector is and I know how big your screen is going to be. And I'm just trying to manage expectations.
Right.
For that kind of experience.
With those expectations and turning off HDR to try and get a desirable effect, depending on what you're trying to get for an outcome, what happens, and we'll talk about this briefly for a few minutes, when this stuff goes wrong? Like what happens, Rob, when you send an HDR signal and the TV's an SDR? How does that manifest?
It's pretty good. They're really there's a fork in the road. Neither result is good, but they are bad in completely the opposite direction.
Yes.
So if you remember earlier, we were talking a little bit about the difference between essentially gamma and log, or an absolute system versus kind of a relative contrast system. So that's where we'll start. So imagine an SDR signal. So the SDR signal has this dynamic range that's more compressed anyway. It's 0 to 100 nits. It's this smaller color volume. It's down in this. It's a smaller amount of information that's coming in. But your display thinks it's HDR, or maybe you accidentally forced it into HDR mode. What it does is it blows up that signal. It goes, oh, you're asking for a little bit of red? How about a lot of red? How about all the red that I'm capable of giving you? And so you get this way over the top saturated, now that there's Spinal Tap 2 out, we can, these amps do go to 11. All of your colors are going to be dialed up in this very extreme.
Greatest Showman red jacket is just red, baby.
I mean, beyond red. It's almost looped around to become green again. It's so red. Right? So you get this extreme saturation. And then also, if that's not obvious enough to your, and it will be, but if that's not obvious enough to your eyes, you're also going to see kind of this extreme kind of color banding that's happening, right? Because I'm using 8-bit color information, assuming that the colors are all close to each other, but I've expanded them out. My display has said, no, this red is here, and the next closest red is a mile away. And I'm only using 8 bits to describe the location. So all of a sudden, huge bands, this extreme over top color. It's obvious there's a huge problem. And then the opposite problem is true when you have HDR and your display thinks it's SDR. So again, remember, HDR is an absolute contrast system. So it's trying to say that 0 is absolute black, but it's also going to give you values for 0.05 nits, which should be different from 0.5 nits, which is different from 1 nit. And so you have, all this deep shadow information. Same thing with the highlights. Here's 100 nits and 500 nits and 1,000 nits and 1,001 nits and all this information. So this huge color volume piece of information. And then your display is set up as a SDR. But because it's set up as SDR, it's not tone mapping. So it just takes everything in that HDR. Imagine a sphere. So imagine the HDR signal is an NBA regulation basketball. And your display doesn't tone map it, but it just goes, let me express that down to the size of a golf ball. So everything just comes closer to the middle. So black gets super bright, white gets super dark. All of the colors get sucked out, from your kind of color gamut. Everything moves toward essentially white and gray. And so you get this super, not exactly black and white, but this sepia colored, like old-timey beige-ish, kind of situation going on. And back in the early days of HDR, this stuff happened all the time. It happened because the wrong metadata was injected by the company mastering the disc, right? They forgot to check a box, and you had a movie that's HDR, but the metadata said it's SDR, and it's like, there you go. Or you would have a movie with good metadata, but your Blu-ray player failed to read it. Or the Blu-ray player read it, but your AVR failed to pass it. Or the AVR passed it, but your HDMI splitter refused to pass it. Or your display couldn't understand it. So you had all of these potential kind of missteps along the way. And then not just failing to pass the data, but there could have been, errors in the metadata itself. It's a very manual kind of process back in the early days. So displays back then and to this day, most displays, if not all displays, in fact, I'm not aware of a display that doesn't have this capability. You can go in and force your display into these modes. Default is usually like auto, but instead you can say, no, HDR10, HDR10 plus, HLG, Dolby Vision. I can force it into that mode because the incoming signal is that, but something has gone broken or sideways. You can do the same thing oftentimes with color space in your display. So instead of being in its auto setting, you can say, no, 709, 2020, P3.
And if you forget,
your eyes will tell you. Your eyes will be the key to say, y'all did something bad. There even was a short period of time. I'll mention this now because it's years ago, and I don't work for this company anymore. But there was a device called the HD Fury. If I remember correctly, it was made by a company in France. And
HD Fury is still around.
Okay, so maybe I shouldn't say this. I'm going to anyway. Back in the day, there was one of the original boxes. I ended up using it a lot in my demonstrations because essentially it would strip some of the data coming through the HDMI cable, which would allow me to overcome some of these metadata mismatches.
Yeah.
So it would be like, and technically what made it a little sketchy is it kind of broke HDMI encryption at the time. So it was like, oh, okay, I'm still going to do it because I got to get this demo to work. Mm-hmm. I used to roll around with an HD Fury, this very small one, but the size of a,
You got to be in control of the HDMI signal.
Yeah, you have to know what's going on.
So if you're not in control, it's a world of pain.
It absolutely is. And so HDR's come a long way. I guess kind of conclusion, HDR has come a long way. It has proven to be, I think, a huge benefit to not only content creators from film and TV shows and movies, the ability to be more expressive, whether they're chasing realism or whether they're chasing kind of something that's more surreal and more dreamlike. It's just more power to the artist.
Yeah.
I think it's also benefited consumers in that in many ways content has improved. Now, again, if you're willing to make some accommodation to your viewing environment, if you want to watch Alien at night with the lights turned off, I mean, you can kind of affect your experience, right? But the potential for this improved viewing experience exists to see, more than you've ever seen before, to experience something that's just more visually dynamic and interesting. That exists. And so I think it's been a huge boon overall for the industry. Unlike, again, the first attempt at 8K, which was only driven from purely display manufacturers looking to try to force something out of the market. 3D was largely the same thing, right? Trying to really force something. The only artists that were looking for it were the slasher movies. Like, how many times can you have an axe thrown at your face in the middle of like a horror movie before it loses its novelty? But HDR has been it's been a fun ride. There's still a lot more improvements that are going to happen, over time. More studios are still kind of learning how to get the best HDR experience, how to master it, how to shoot it. And I think the future, pun intended, is very bright for this type of content to be delivered. And as we also move forward, the very last thing I'll say is, as we continue to move forward with enhancements in display technologies, So again, that's, Epson released a little over a year ago a series of high brightness residential projectors. So certainly well positioned to take more advantage of HDR. But then also you have the potential to look at different kinds of laser assemblies in a projector to improve color gamut. In TVs, we've gone from no dimming backlight to full array to mini LED. OLED came about, quantum dot. Now we're looks like we're going to be very soon going to be able to experience some combination of micro LED, RGB, quantum dot display. It's like all of these amazing advancements are giving us the ability to take advantage of this HDR format.
Mm-hmm.
Not even necessarily up to 10,000 nits, that's still a little ways down the road, but just more color, more dynamic range, more nuance, and I think more enjoyability for everything that we like to watch.
Before we wrap this up, a quick word from our sponsor, Martin Logan.
Martin Logan delivers high-performance audio that fuses cutting-edge technology with sleek, elegant design. Engineered for audiophiles and home theater enthusiasts alike, Martin Logan products bring every sound to life with incredible clarity and power. Discover more at martinlogan.com and visit a dealer near you. Martin Logan, bringing you truth in sound since 1983.
Welcome back. I just want to thank Rob and Epson for coming out and really breaking down HDR for our audience, explaining why it's important, what tone mapping is. But thank you again for taking your time to come out here and spend it with us and impart your knowledge on the community so that the industry as a whole can continue to evolve, continue to take the tools and the lessons learned and put that into action so that we can make this space as a whole better. So thanks for coming out. Anything you want to say in wrapping this up before we close this thing up?
For me, I'm thrilled to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk to your audience. If you haven't had a chance, go look at a projector. But other than that, it's just a pleasure. And thanks for having me.
Okay.
Yes, and thank you, Rob. Always love having you on these.
Well, appreciate you coming out and spending your time with us. Eric, thanks for joining us as always. Shout out to Eric. He's the one that edits all of these videos. I get to come on and host these and talk to the guests and stuff. He's the man that puts all this together and edits them afterwards, sometimes more than others. But huge shout out to you for making all that happen.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And thanks to our sponsors that have done all of this. And we got more videos coming. This isn't just me wrapping up the entire series. Thanks for our sponsors for making all of this possible. So again, stay safe out there. Thanks again, Rob. Thanks again, Eric.